Hello, I'm Susannah Streeter. Welcome to the Forces in Mind Trust launch of Lifting Our Sights Beyond 2030. Can the UK really be the best place in the world to be a veteran? That's the question at the heart of the next 60 minutes as we launch the Forces in Mind Trust's new report, Lifting Our Sights Beyond 2030, which focuses on the impact of future trends on the transition of our armed forces community from military to civilian life. The coming decade will see enormous, historic changes. Global power dynamics are shifting. The characteristics of conflict are being recast. We're faced with a climate crisis, the COVID recovery, and all at a time that we find ourselves in the crucible of the fourth industrial revolution, with the fires of digital transformation rippling through our private and professional lives. For the armed forces community, there will be challenges, but also opportunities, which are outlined in today's landmark report. So please do go to liftingOurSights.org.uk and download your own copy. Now, I'm really delighted to say that over the next hour, we have a great lineup of guests who can help take us through the trends and the tools set out in the report.
Coming up, Tobias Ellwood, former Defence Minister, now Chair of the Defence Select Committee. Nick Roberts, the CEO of Travis Perkins plc. And Air Vice-Marshal Ray Locke, Chief Executive of the Forces in Mind Trust. We'll also be hearing about the transition journeys of two ex-service personnel.
I was obviously used to being a robust soldier, and then all of a sudden you're a plumber, or it's a hard definition of change.
I did have problems. I suffered with sort of a loss of purpose and a loss of direction, but also just straightforward, felt very anxious, felt very depressed.
Well, as you know, this is what the Forces in Mind Trust is all about, enabling all ex-service personnel and their families to transition into successful and fulfilled civilian lives. It's a subject close to my own heart too, having spent 10 years in the RAF Reserve. But the most important people here today are you, the audience at home. You certainly don't need to be an Air Vice-Marshal, a CEO or an MP to get involved. So please do join the conversation using the hashtag Lifting Our Sights and by commenting on YouTube. Now, the Lifting Our Sights report identified more than 30 trends and shifts which could take place over the next decade. And that's quite an array, as you can now see on the screen. Let's home in now on some of the key changes and the impact they could have.
Lifting Our Sights identifies 5 key future shifts that will drive change in the UK and affect the armed forces community. Climate and ecological crises will mean more extreme and unpredictable weather. In this altered landscape, new triggers for conflict emerge. The military will be vital in mitigation and response. Advances in data and automation will transform society. For the armed forces, operations will be increasingly data-driven, creating highly marketable skills for some, but not all. Data could also deliver more targeted support across society, including for service leavers. Inequality will rise, but other pressures could reduce welfare spending, placing pressure on the charitable sector. With many competing interests, support for those transitioning to civilian life could decline. The characteristics of conflict will continue to evolve. Assets won't always be visible. Expect cyber warfare, bio-warfare, operations in space, and continued nuclear deterrence. But also a leaner military, less physical conflict, and fewer casualties. globally power dynamics are shifting, with implications for the UK's influence. Combined with a decline in visibility in physical warfare, public understanding and support for the armed forces could decline. These future trends will create significant challenges for the armed forces community unless we act now.
So some big changes and some big challenges there. Well, to discuss them, I'd like to start by welcoming Ray Locke, Chief Executive of the Forces in Mind Trust. Ray is a retired Royal Air Force pilot and commander whose extensive operational career included flying Tornado, Hawk and Hercules aircraft. Welcome, Ray. It's also a pleasure to welcome Patrick Harris, who's a Director of Foresight at Future Agenda, which produced the Lifting Our Sights report, which you can, of course, read for yourselves. Welcome to you, Patrick. Well, Ray, I'd like to start with you and talk about the fact that that film highlighted some pretty massive future trends in the report. Which one do you think is likely to have the biggest impact on the armed forces community?
Yeah, I mean, thanks, Susannah. You're right to say highlight because, of course, we can't do justice to the full report in this programme today, or indeed the 30 trends that it's identified. But if you look at the big macro trends around data and automation, if you look at the perhaps more focused trends around the changing characteristics of conflict, the changing way in which skills are required, and indeed the smaller number of people within the armed forces themselves, then we believe that these all contribute to what is the biggest trend, which is going to be change in perception. This fracture between the reality of what it is to have been in the armed forces and what the public perception is. And over the next decade, this fracture is going to grow and it's going to become more damaging unless we do something about it.
Okay, thanks very much, Ray. Let me bring in Patrick, because Patrick, you were the lead researcher on this report. What trends really stood out for you, and why is it really important that big macro changes are the starting point?
Good morning, Susannah. The macro changes I'll start with first. These feature right at the top of the report because, frankly, these are items that will affect everyone and where there's little or no disagreement. We sometimes refer to these as certainties. You'll also find the other trends inside the report are packaged, some on the UK in 2030, some on armed forces and transition, and some on the charitable sector. As for what stood out for me, well, all of them are important because they were meaningful or relevant for someone that we spoke with. But I suppose as researchers, we're often more interested in things like the interplay between them. And with that in mind, I would highlight the 4 priority action areas that we point to in the report. And these are the areas where we think there's the greatest opportunity to impact outcome for veterans in the future. I'll quickly run through those, if I may. The first of those is something we call empowered civilian. It's about equipping veterans to lead successful and fulfilling lives and recognizing their responsibilities in that. A second called personalized transition. This is about designing around individual circumstances of veterans and their families and probably starting an earlier dialogue about the transition. Thirdly, accurate perception, which is precisely what Ray was talking about building public understanding of the role of the military and transfer. Finally, something we call empowering the system, which is about the most relevant ecosystems of civilian and military life, together understanding the transition journey and collaborating in key areas like data or measurement or say, accountability.
Okay, thanks, Patrick. Ray, why now? Why commission this report right now?
Well, I mean, over the last 12 to 18 months, we've watched our colleagues, our friends on the front line of service provision really struggle and battle through the challenges of COVID. And at times it's felt like, we've been downstairs choosing a new kitchen while upstairs the roof has been on fire. But, to an extent, that's exactly what Forces in Mind Trust was established to do. Not to buy kitchens, obviously, but to look ahead, to produce the evidence, to present it to people who can act upon it in a way that they understand, that they're credible, and that they can take forward and improve a lot of the armed forces community. So it's exactly the right time to do this.
Thanks, Ray. And just briefly, Patrick, some people may disagree with some of the assumptions in the report. How did you approach this subject?
Well, I'm pleased to say we didn't start with any assumptions. So we rather stand on the shoulders of the experts and stakeholders that we involve. The future is obviously filled with endless possibilities, but by involving informed experts and stakeholders, we can hone some of those possibilities into probabilities. And that's precisely what we did with lifting our sights. We did some 50 one-to-one interviews with stakeholders, and again, topic matter experts in topics like inequality or philanthropy or cybersecurity. Mm-hmm. We did a stream of virtual workshops, which were about broadening those trends and understanding their potential for impact and perhaps their implications. A second stream of workshops where we tested some of our findings. And then we underpinned all of this, not with foresight, with something else called ethnography, which gave us a solid grounding on transition today. If I may quickly say thank you to all of those people who gave us their time and thoughts throughout. It really is their research and their report.
And thank you, Patrick, as well. And thanks also to Ray. Now, it's time to digest a little bit more about what the changes mean for the UK and armed forces community. Ray will be coming back a little bit later to answer some of your questions as well. But earlier this week, I spoke to Tobias Ellwood MP, chair of the Defence Select Committee and former Defence Minister who served in the Royal Green Jackets. I began by asking him what he thinks the most significant challenges are facing the UK armed forces in 2030 and beyond.
Well, what a big question. I mean, we've just had the integrated review that spelled out, I think, how complex and dangerous our world is becoming. Britain traditionally has stepped forward. We did it a couple of times on a major scale in the last century, and we as a nation have to decide ourselves as to what role we actually want to play on our own, but also with our allies as well. Now, we are influential. We have great contacts around the world, and we're good at thinking about the problems as well. But we do need the hard power to be able to step forward, to show an example of what we actually want to do. But we are getting into a very dangerous situation, pulled in different directions, and then a whole new dimension of threat, if you like, which is the cyber capability. As we become ever more reliant on the movement of data, it's provided another dimension for which our world can be threatened.
Certainly. So how do you think the Lifting Our Sights report can be used, and what are the dangers of ignoring it?
Well, it's so important that we leverage and continue to build on the strengths of our armed forces. From my mind, it's always been about making sure we look after our veterans and our armed forces throughout their entire lives. You join, whether it be as a cadet, whether you as a regular or as a reservist, then you depart, you become a veteran. It's the entire package of support that we need to provide. Just take a tricky situation at the moment that we're dealing with in Parliament, the vexatious claims in Northern Ireland. How does a new recruit look at that and think, am I going to be looked after myself if I'm in a tricky situation in Ukraine or so forth? I want to make sure my government, the nation, the British people, have got my backs. It's so important that we continue to work on these things.
Yeah, it's interesting you talk about that, because veterans issues are often seen as an MOD concern, but in reality, we're talking about issues that impact on every government department. Are they listening, do you think?
Well, we hope they are, because it is that final resort that you put our armed forces in harm's way. It's Parliament that actually votes on those events, to actually do that. And it does mean that diplomacy has broken down. But what we're going to do is to defend what we believe in, our standards and values. It's so important that our training and our professionalism continues as high as it does, because if we drop our guard, if we lower our standards, then we have to ask ourselves, why are we fighting? Because we step forward in order to defend these values and standards. So important that our armed forces do that. And I think we can be very proud, looking at armed forces across the world, of the high standards that we have.
So as you say, we're seeing fundamental changes in the global balance of power. How should the UK be adapting to this?
Well, we've seen some interesting documentation coming out with greater cyber resilience. We've got a cyber force as well, a space force too. You can see these new dimensions absolutely coming in. But it was interesting, General Patrick Saunders last week saying, there's no point in taking a computer to a knife fight, unless, of course, you're going to gift the computer and then run away. But ultimately, he was trying, very simply put, to say you still need conventional capability. And I'm a little bit concerned that our armed forces are dropping in numbers, particularly with the army as well. We need upstream engagement. We need to keep friends closer to us. For me, the biggest threat of the next 10, 20 years, which is the sort of timescale that you're referring to, is not a direct Cold War-esque type challenge with military might either side of an Iron Curtain. For me, it's about us being nudged out by China, by Russia, as favoured nation status with Commonwealth countries and so forth, who are forced to choose whether to look towards China and their technology, their economy, their One Belt, One Road, or indeed their militarization, or indeed towards the West as well. For me, that is where the big the bipolar world, the threat of us splitting into two arenas is the big challenge for us.
So huge issues ahead. What changes do you think all of these will mean for the way that service personnel transition to civilian life?
Well, see, this is a big question. As you've illustrated in some of your documentation, it's quite a shock, to go from what is an arena that you're familiar with, that you've been in for many, many years. You've got all your friends and buddies on any garrison, on any ship, or on any air base. You only need to walk to the local NAFI and you'll find some friends there to chat. Suddenly you depart and you're all on your own. And it is quite a culture shock as well. We should make it very clear that the majority of people absolutely transition without a problem. But I remember my own experience when I departed from the armed forces. That was it. Off you go. Thanks very much indeed. In fact, as soon as I dared put my hand up, then I was given all the rotten jobs that you get, in a battalion that nobody else wants to do. Well, that's not the best way to look after our people, particularly if they might want to come back a couple of years later, which we can absolutely now do. But what I would stress is the skill sets that you develop whilst you're in the armed forces are second to none. Your dexterity, your determination, your grit, your tenacity, your sense of humour, your willingness just to get a job done. I mean, these are assets which I hope any business, any organisation would be delighted to receive. The trick is, how do you get somebody that's had to deal with, looking after the GPMG in Afghanistan? How do you then translate those skills of fortitude and confidence into the modern day arena, particularly when there's so much technology going around in Civvy Street today?
What is one action you would like to see the current government to take to really improve the outlook for UK armed forces and veterans?
Well, I think what we need to do is actually celebrate our armed forces more. If we think about the bond that you have with our armed forces and society, on an individual level, it's very, very strong. But it's not as personal as it used to be. I recall when I was a little child, I sat on the knee of my grandfather. He served in the Second World War. He had a load of medals above the fireplace, and he was able to point to them to say what he did. Now, simply because our armed forces are so much smaller now, that exposure that any individual has to people who actually serve is much, much more diminished. So I think the government needs to do more to celebrate what our armed forces do. We're quite reticent and reserved, if you like, in Britain. In America, they do it in such a different style. You're made, if you transfer from one base to another and you're going by public transport, you're made to wear your dress uniform, and you'll see them in the airports. Not only that, is complete strangers will go up to that individual and say, "Thank you for your service." Now that really makes you proud, and it also encourages a younger generation of young nippers, youngsters and so on like that, to say, wow, there's an ambassador for me. I might want to actually be in their shoes. There's my hero.
Tobias Ellwood MP, thank you very much.
Tobias Ellwood there, discussing some of the huge global trends that will likely shape the next decade. The transition from military to civilian life is something that would be faced by individuals, often adjusting to profound changes affecting both their professional and personal lives. Let's take a look at some of the realities of that journey through the eyes of two veterans.
I found transition from the military to be quite difficult. Having been in there from the age of 16, I find it quite daunting. Didn't feel like I really belonged back where I came from.
I suffered with sort of a loss of purpose and a loss of direction, but also just straightforward, felt very anxious, felt very depressed.
Obviously used to being a robust soldier, and then all of a sudden you're a plumber, or it's a hard definition of change. The support that I had during or before leaving the services was quite minimal.
I spoke to someone very briefly, and they were sort of checking that I wasn't going to be homeless and that maybe I didn't have an alcohol dependency. It was a very kind of strange, generalised welfare check, but not exactly caring.
With regards to doing CVs properly, how to pay bills, all that type of stuff that you would all normally do, is normally done for us. So I quite struggled with it, with the process, because I wasn't helped that much, which was a little bit of a nightmare for myself coming back into society.
I can remember being unemployed, being on the dole, and being told by a well-meaning clerk that they had the perfect job for me. It was working in the town centre, fining people for dog fouling. You get to wear a little uniform and you get to tell people what to do. You love that.
Perception of some employers towards veterans is that some of us have no transferable skills, which isn't correct. It's a lot harder for me to put my transferable skills onto pieces of paper for employers to understand, not having to write a CV my whole army career, because don't need to. We literally do the job. If you're good enough to do the job, you go up in the world.
These weird perceptions can pervade, all manner of interactions. Sometimes you meet people for the first time in a friendly environment, and they're very hostile. I mean, at worst, I've been called a murderer, which is, a stretch.
Most challenging thing about leaving is fitting back into society. I felt for a long time that I didn't belong. I felt like I'd been institutionalised within the army, and once I'd lost that was my problem.
I have felt at times that my life has been utterly derailed because I've been prevented from doing the thing that I'm trained for, the thing that I loved, and the thing that I was good at. You then wonder, well, what else is there? There's no point. And that can take you to some dark places. So, yeah, in short, yes, very difficult. And in long, it comes and goes, it ebbs and flows, it gets better.
Two very powerful accounts of transition there. Now, understanding personal stories like these was a fundamental element of the Lifting Our Sights research. And while the majority do have a successful transition from military to civilian life, many people, like Fiona and Mike, do face challenges. So let's hear a little bit more about the evidence collected on the transition journey and just what it can tell us.
Hi, so my name's Robin Pharoah, and I led the part of the Lifting Our Sights Foresight research program that was looking specifically at the experiences of ex-service personnel going through transition today. We conducted a fairly large ethnographic research project. We had 30 ex-service personnel involved who all gave very detailed personal narratives of their experiences of transition. I think it's important to have their voices included in the research, not just because that's an important component of any project like this, but also because looking at real lived experiences keeps us grounded when thinking about the future, and allows us to think about how grand shifts and changes in society in the future, how they will play out on the ground, on real lived experiences. We were also able to look at all those narratives and explore commonalities and themes, shared experiences that they'd all had, and construct what we called a model of the transition journey, broken down into 8, if you like, common phases that all of the people went through. And we do think that all of them, to some extent, touched on each of the phases that we identified. You should not read the model as a prescription for how transition will work for each person. Each phase will impact differently and last for a different amount of time and have different implications for them. But we do think that each phase is touched on by each person. And if you want to hear more of the colour and the richness of the stories that were shared and how they played out across each of those stages, it's probably best to go and look at the ethnographic report that we've created. But it's worth talking about a couple of those phases, perhaps, to give you an idea of how they work. So the first is the joining phase, which is maybe counterintuitive. This is before people have even joined the services and before they enter anything that we might think of as transition. And I felt it was important to recognise, and so did the people who shared their narratives with us, that there is a level of expectation and hope that comes with joining the armed services. And that, in a sense, sets a benchmark against which they'll judge their own outcomes, their own transition outcomes, which is interesting. Other significant phases, we've called one the threshold phase, which really lasts no longer than a day or even an hour, which is the very moment at which someone crosses the wire, leaves the armed services, moves back into civilian life. But it's that specific moment when, for some of them, it involved no more than a handshake and a smile and walking through a door into the great unknown. And I thought that contrasted greatly with the kinds of rituals and rites of passage that they might go through that help them join up and become part of the military services. In contrast, there's very little ceremony for many of them around that moment of leaving. And immediately following that is the phase that we've called confrontation, where we describe the kind of psychological impact of the culture shock of leaving one very powerful institution and having to confront the institutions of the civilian world and cope with the day-to-day realities of having new kinds of responsibilities and new kinds of things to do and new kinds of relationships to form. Another good phase to focus on, perhaps, is the landing phase, the very last phase of transition, which I would describe as the long tail of transition. It's the bit that proves that transition never really ends. It's a kind of journey of identity where people will constantly reevaluate themselves in terms of their role in society and how others perceive them. And in that landing phase, even though everything else, every other box is ticked, there's that ongoing sense that I have to reconstitute who I am in relation to the wider cultural narratives around the armed forces and what they do in the world.
Thank you, Robin. And just in case there's anyone still watching who hasn't downloaded the report, don't worry, it's still online at liftingoursights.org.uk. And to all our viewers, if there's anyone you know who you might think would benefit from either the research or the tools it outlines, please do share the link. So we've had a chance to look at the challenges, but what about the opportunities? How can we strategically align the needs of ex-service personnel and their families transitioning into civilian life? How can we make sure the service provision and wider societal support is available? Let's take a look.
Aware of the change and challenges we face by 2030, we can plan a better future for veterans. Strong communities proud to welcome and integrate veteran families will ease transition. This should be combined with holistic resettlement support and understanding of need by public services. Having the right skills and training is vital to life after the armed forces. Service leavers should be given the opportunity to acquire them, supplemented by work placements and internships. Financial planning is crucial for a successful transition. Service personnel should have access to basic money management advice and training to prepare for the realities of civilian life. Direct access to expert armed forces-aware mental and physical health services is essential. Transparency between providers can ensure every service leaver has a digital health and social care plan record and registration into the NHS. The MOD must ensure all leavers have a stable housing solution in the first year of discharge and engage with local authorities on veteran homelessness. Where needed, access to mentoring will help prevent the most at-risk veterans becoming offenders. And joined up UK-wide thinking could help to reduce reoffending. By striving to meet these goals, we can make the UK the best place in the world to be a veteran. As we've just seen, providing service personnel for the right skills and training is vital for their future careers outside the armed forces. But the nature of work is fundamentally changing for all of us. For example, with more people likely to work until later in life and having to adjust to new ways of working. In addition, constant reskilling and upskilling are expected to become the norm. To discuss all of this, I'm delighted to be joined by Nick Roberts, Chief Executive Officer of Travis Perkins plc, the UK's largest distributor of building materials and a FTSE 250 firm, as well as a trustee of Forces in Mind Trust. Great to have you here, Nick. Thank you very much for joining us. Now, the report identifies that many veterans lack the skills and confidence necessary to work in business. Does this chime with your experience as an employer?
Well, it does to a certain extent, Susannah, and I think the report actually calls this out very clearly and is a really positive step forward. I think in many respects there's perhaps still a lack of understanding around what skills are required in the future and what gaps there are. For sure, there are areas around data and digital and AI and other technological skills, but of course there are other things that I think the armed forces can bring that are really needed in the workplace around logistics and fulfillment. And one of the ironies of the pandemic, perhaps, is that we have all, the general public and employers, seen the armed forces in tremendous light in some of those capacities. I think there is still too much pigeonholing in many employers of the skills that are thought to come from armed forces personnel around discipline and commitment and structure, which are all very true and very laudable. But actually there is, a great set of skills around really thinking about outcomes as opposed to process, really thinking about actually how to deal with ambiguity and to be agile, all of which should mean that armed forces leavers should be really confident about the relevance of their skills in an ever-changing world of work.
Yeah, it's really interesting, isn't it, with the accelerated shift to digital? And do you think looking ahead, there'll be an expectation to reskill and upskill consistently all the time, given this acceleration doesn't look like it's going to be slowing down anytime soon?
Oh, absolutely. And I think, the pandemic has just created a new impetus around that. I think it's really positive that so many service leavers will have, well-structured digital skills. In fact, essential digital skills are lacking in society as a whole. And so that's a huge positive. And digitalization of businesses is now rapidly progressing, as opposed to just new channels to customers. And so I think service leavers with those skills will also see different ways around the problem of digitalising core processes within companies. So I think that's a huge advantage for service leavers in the future over many of their civilian counterparts.
What opportunities are there to work with the government and the armed forces community to ensure that businesses can really understand and utilise the skills of service leaders in the future?
Well, I think there's much greater understanding needed. My reflection on the report was that really called it out. So much is changing so very rapidly. Structures are becoming less rigid. The whole emphasis on ways of working, as you mentioned earlier, is changing. And it's changing for both. I mean, the integrated review for the defence community called that out. And of course, for civilian employers, that's changing very rapidly and has accelerated as a result of the pandemic. So actually, what is the operating model that we both need for the future? Understanding that, I think, will be key to understanding the opportunities for greater collaboration. We are working closely with the government on youth employment through the Kickstart scheme, massive investment in apprenticeships. Actually, can we collaborate around those sorts of models, not just nationally, but locally, and in a much more kind of porous way on secondments, experiences with employers? But that has to be planned through service leavers' careers.
So how do you think then the private sector can support the Armed Forces community via the Armed Forces Covenant in particular?
Investment in the Armed Forces Covenant is really positive for any employer. We've done it at Travis Perkins and my previous employer as well, and there is huge benefit there. Really understanding how a vehicle like the Armed Forces Covenant can be used in a really agile way, as opposed to lots of pledges which can sometimes become quite onerous and actually get in the way of agile interventions locally and on the ground to give insight, give skills, and just give confidence to people who are contemplating life after their service careers that actually they have relevant skills to the workplace. I think some of this needs to be really driven around the purpose of organisations. The best organisations are really emphasising their purpose, what the role they play in society, what cause they are fighting, what their meaning is. And service personnel really relate to that by dint of their service.
Thank you so much, Nick Roberts, CEO of Travis Perkins plc. Great to have your insights.
Some really interesting thoughts from Nick there, and an overall positive perspective looking ahead. It's time now to think about the role of public service providers and charities over the next decade. And to do that, I'm joined by a great panel. So please welcome to Adrian Peters, Head of Transition at the Career Transition Partnership, Kate Davies, Director of Health and Justice, Armed Forces and Sexual Assault Referral Centres for NHS England, Councillor Isabel Seccombe, OBE, who's the leader of Warwickshire County Council, Melanie Waters, Chief Executive of Help for Heroes, and Air Vice-Marshal Chris Elliott, Controller of the RAF Benevolent Fund. Welcome to you all. It's really great to have you here on the panel today. And I'd like to start with Adrian. Adrian, as we heard from two veterans earlier, their stories really showed that there are clear challenges. Are their experiences consistent with what you see in your work at the Career Transition Partnership?
I think that every individual who goes through settlement, it's a very personal experience. I reflect on my experience leaving 12 years ago and my personally going through the highs and lows of my journey. So I recognise that. What I would say is that I think early engagement in the resettlement process is vital because it enables people to look at their transferable skills and understand how they want to approach resettlement, how they want to go through it. And if I look ahead to 2030, I'm quite excited about the future. I'm quite optimistic about it. I think the skills that people acquire in the military, that learnability that Nick talked about, the constant updating and refreshing of skills, will enable service leavers to compete really well in 2030.
It's interesting that we hear about the challenges of housing finance and a broader knowledge of how life works outside the services. Why do you think these life skills are so crucial?
Because transition isn't just about employment. You know, we are very focused on employment, and rightly so. But it's about the whole holistic bit of life. People don't do life in isolation, and I think if you've got that broad pattern, that the bits can derail the employment side of it. So it's very important to approach and meet the need. And what is the pressing need? And again, ultimately, for many people, it comes down to employment is the pressing need. But for others, it is different. And in making sure that holistic support is in place.
Absolutely. Well, let me bring in Izzi now, leader of Warwickshire County Council. Welcome, Izzi. Now, the Lifting Our Sights report says that in future we'll see fewer military bases across the UK and more integration of service families into communities. Do you think that local authorities are ready for this?
I think we have to be ready for this. It's so important. We've seen the support that the armed services have given over the last year through the COVID pandemic, the stability and the confidence that they have provided to the voluntary sector and to us as council service providers. And it's so important that what we do is integrate the transition of the future to make sure that what we are building is the world that we want for the future. We've seen how climate change has become such a prevalent issue in our younger generation, actually in all generations. And part of that is the type of offer that we build in our communities. Now, I believe that the skill set that is acquired within the armed forces has a very vital role to play. But I think we haven't been wonderfully good at transitioning and making people feel part of the community that they end up living in. But actually, the world that we design for the future has to be one that is relevant for all our society, for all groups. We know that the pandemic has been an issue for some of our low-income society and also for some of our BME society. And that absolutely must be addressed. So we have a chance to reinvent our future. And I think it's an opportunity. It's exciting. We need new skills, and many of those are acquired in the armed forces, and we need to welcome them with open arms.
So a key role for local authorities there. You mentioned as well the effects of the pandemic. The charitable sector has been badly affected by the pandemic, donations dropping. Chris, let me bring in you here. Now, the Lifting Our Sights report identifies that the charity sector will be further squeezed potentially in the future. So how do we make sure that veterans don't lose its support?
I think the report is a fantastic opportunity for all of us to sit back and just reflect. But Susannah, what I would say is the charity sector has got an opportunity now, as it's done through COVID, to be flexible and accessible to all. So I think as I reflect on the report, is looking forward 10 years, is I see an ecosystem that I hope will be better connected. The data that is available now, that is shared widely, and our knowledge on where our veterans are and what needs that they have is more explicit, and we become more proactive instead of reactive. So I think we've learned a lot during COVID, and I think the charity sector has been amazing in its response with income being down. And I can reflect on the benevolent funds experience that we've used technology in a way that we probably would have taken us quite some time, but COVID forced us to become more agile. And I think that we've been able to reach out and be more accessible to our veterans as well. But I do think it will take an ecosystem to make this happen. And I think it brings that out.
Absolutely. Okay, thank you very much, Chris. Kate, let me bring in you now, because the NHS clearly has done an amazing amount to support the armed forces community, a lot of it under your leadership. But looking ahead, what do you think the main issues will be in providing continuous care between Defence Medical and National Health Services?
I mean, you're quite right. This has been one of our priorities. I think what actually I'd like to emphasise from the report and my panel members' feedback is actually more collaboration. So I think the NHS has been able to work with the armed forces community, both reservists serving and their families and carers, and veterans and their families and carers, because we've actually done this together, and also much more co-production with lived experience. Often our men and women that are transitioning from the military into their homes, their society, civilian life, often say, you know, the NHS needs to learn to speak military. And I think that's really one of the things that we've been doing, is how can we get that collaboration? How can we ensure, whether it's mental health services, prosthetic services, just, you know, everyday appointments with your GP or a hospital trust, how do we get people to be much more aware of armed forces personnel and veterans and family and carer needs? And how can we actually also commission, fund, train our staff to be more understanding of what that means as a patient who has at once served, whether that's weeks, months or years. And lastly, I think just going back to some of the other points, we've got a programme which we're co-funding called Step Into Health, which is really about how armed forces personnel can be amazing employees of the NHS. We're a massive employer. What can we do on all elements? We've seen that in COVID, the alignment with the armed forces has been exceptional. But what we really need to do is recognise that all of the men and women serving and leaving and as veterans are our patients. We've just published a new Armed Forces Forward View. The third commitment in the 9 commitments of that is about helping transition from armed forces to civilian life. So our commitment is there within the NHS Constitution, but we've really got to do it on a very personable, individual basis at the same time.
Thank you very much, Kate. You've identified a number of really key issues there, and it's really interesting because Help for Heroes emerged because of a gap in provision for injured soldiers returning from Iraq and Afghanistan. So, Melanie, I'd really like to get your view on how you think armed forces charities might need to change to respond to the new types of warfare that we've been hearing about a little earlier on, which might leave long-lasting psychological impacts.
Thank you, Susannah, and good morning, everyone. I think the armed forces charities will certainly have to change, and we've already done that through COVID. conflict is less visible, the methods of operating in the forces has changed, and we have to consider the type of support that we offer what is a future veteran, and we appreciate the future veteran identity might be different. It's a changing workforce, more diverse personnel, it may not be a career path, more people may be reservists, and we have to think about, would those individuals identify as a veteran? So we have to be, as an armed forces sector, I believe, more flexible and not think about fixed models. We need to think about how we work more collaboratively, that Chris has mentioned. And I think we really need to think about how we get close to the changing veteran of the future. Who are we helping? Where are they? What do they need? How do we work with them, as Kate suggested, in co-creating the services they might need for the future? And we need to consider what community they belong to, what experience do they want? Do they want digital services? How will they access support? And that will certainly help us design our support and services and advocacy for their future needs. And for that, we also have to think as charities about our relevance. How do we engage the public? Obviously, Help for Heroes did that in a particular way in 2007. Extinction Rebellion has done that in different ways now. How do we remain relevant to the great British public? And how do we ensure that the needs of the future veteran are met, whether they're wounded or not?
So many challenges. Thanks very much. Let me ask Kate, though, now, how could advances in data, do you think, benefit veterans in particular?
I mean, the NHS has, I think, had one of its biggest priorities in the last 10 years around our digital capacity. And I think it was mentioned very clearly in the report around, and on your VT a minute ago, around patient records. I think it is essential that we absolutely support the partnership agreement between transition, serving and leaving as part of the patient records of digital care. I mean, I've been having the pleasure of leading this for a number of years, and we absolutely know that often it was literally a fax machine or a paper information exchange that was often part of what that means around those complex needs in to do with patient care, or just to do with good practice of people leaving and moving around the country. And particularly, I have to say, this emphasis for families as well, and families and carers of men and women that serve and our veterans. One of our biggest priorities to ensure that we have swift, up-to-date and supportive digital NHS care for our families and our veterans and our serving personnel, but particularly that collaboration around how different systems talk to one another. And I think that's something that's still a challenge, to be honest, but is improving and certainly a priority.
Yeah, it's interesting. You mentioned all of this and this huge demand at the moment for this transition to this kind of new digital world. And Chris, how will data better help your work? You say that you've already sped up the whole process at the fund.
Well, I think it's really important to use data to make sure that you're making the right decisions, not just from our perspective as a charity, but across the sector, because at the heart of this is an individual and their families. And I think it's really important that we keep that in our minds, because data and making good decisions around that data is going to be really important. But I go back to the point is potentially not making decisions on our own. Greater collaboration, greater coordination, but also greater engagement potentially with the Ministry of Defence and other state organisations, that we can make sure we're a really strong ecosystem for those individuals and their families to be transitioned out from service into society. But I think we've got to be very careful about sort of language around this as well, because not all people who leave identify as a veteran. We have people who are leaving in their 20s after a few years, right to people who have served for over 40 years. And we've got to be very careful that we talk about the individual and maybe not put labels on people as well, because people need to be able to access these services and not feel as if they're excluded from the services as well. So I think it's really important we keep the individual and their families in our mind, no matter what we do in the next 10 years and beyond.
Absolutely. Melanie, I'd like to move on just briefly, because as the report points out, we're seeing grassroots movements like Extinction Rebellion and Black Lives Matter really capture public attention. What do you think the charity sector can learn from them?
Well, as you can imagine, I mean, Extinction Rebellion was a movement which was based on disruption, and that can be quite difficult for established charities who have, legal entities, they have a governance structure. But that doesn't mean that we can't learn. And I think what we see in organisations like Extinction Rebellion is a sense of urgency. And they are also a source of inspiration, whether they use media, social media. I think we can think about ourselves in the charity sector as how do we inspire the nation? How do we inspire individuals? And how do we respond and communicate quickly? And Chris suggesting data might be a way of doing that. And how do we state the case and call people to act so that people want to do something? And I think we can learn from that. But I think there are other things that we need to consider to capture the attention of the nation, which may not come particularly from Extinction Rebellion type examples. I think we can show the changing nature of the armed forces and be creative about that as a charity sector, and to demonstrate the positivity of a veteran, however they identify themselves. And we can show veterans in people's communities and help them demonstrate their worth in communities and their values by education, by trying to get the public to really buy into the positive. Mm-hmm. After all, veterans really want to give back into their communities post-service.
Absolutely. And let me bring
serve.
So I'm sorry, I just wanted to bring in Izzi just right at the end, because you talk about how important veterans are within the community. And of course, it's going to be up to local authorities to provide a lot of the services. How will you, Izzi, need support to do this in years to come?
And that's absolutely the point. This is at a time when local authority budgets have been challenged, and we have some really difficult things for the future, deciding how we shape the communities. And yet, throughout the COVID pandemic, we've seen how important delivery of local is. So I would champion the need for local communities who know the identity within their areas and how we can deliver to those individuals and to those small groups in a far more collective way than we can on a national scale. So it's vitally important that funding supports local authorities who need to then support those who are transitioning and finding it more difficult than some, and probably the majority who transition very well. But the value, I go back to the value of the armed forces has to be part of the importance of how we establish the relationship within communities, within neighbourhoods, of what our veterans can offer, because it's a fantastic service. And we are blessed in Warwickshire. We have 2 bases, but I know how difficult it is for authorities who do not have bases in their area, in their geography, to understand that relationship. And I find it the more important for me, being in that position, to share my knowledge and my value of them.
Thank you very much, Izzi. I'd like to give the last word to Adrian. Adrian, what do you think the MOD and others need to do to ensure that service leaders are ready for the civilian world?
I think there's a bit about protecting what is there. We've got a really fantastic system in place. Yes, it can be improved, and there's constantly, and this report recognises and looks forward to the future of what it can be. But we, what the MOD have and the military have is the envy of other countries. We're constantly asked, how do you do it in the UK? What can we learn from you? And I think we need to celebrate the success, the point that Tobias made. Be proud of what's there, but look to build it and improve it. And the next decade is exciting.
Adrian, thank you very much. And thanks to all of you for some really fascinating contributions. But we are almost out of time. But before we go, I would like to return to Ray Locke, Chief Executive of the Forces in Mind Trust. And for those of you who don't know, Ray is in his last few weeks at the Trust. So the launch of the Lifting Our Sights report really is his swan song. I'm also joined by Fiona Smith, who gave a really honest and moving account of her transition journey a little earlier. So Fiona, you've listened to everything that everybody has said. What help do you think would have made the most difference to you?
I think it's worth remembering that every person who transitions is different and every situation is different. So a little more tailoring of support and being aware of what is out there and just making it more accessible.
Okay, and do you feel more optimistic, having listened to what's been said today, that lifting our sights can put us on a path towards a better future for veterans?
I would like to focus on the positive. I think the report is really sound. There's some great ideas in there. We just need to implement them and take them to heart. There is a lot of support and goodwill out there. It just needs to be connected with the people who need it most. And that could be local authorities, that could be through charities. All kinds of agencies can work together to help deliver the best outcome for veterans.
Okay, Fiona, thank you so much for your contribution today. And I'd like to bring in Ray now. Ray, we asked for some questions. I'd like to put one to you now. It's all very well writing this report, but how will you make sure it doesn't get ignored?
Yeah, my chairman always tells me, Ray, don't produce another doorstop. This afternoon, I'm taking my successor, Mike Ecological, across to the Ministry of Defence. We have a meeting with the Minister for Veterans, Theo Doherty. We have a meeting with the new Director of the Office of Veterans Affairs. We'll be taking it to the party conferences. We'll be taking it to the COPSIO annual general meeting. This is, you say it's my swan song. It's not about me. This is about the start of a movement, lifting our sights. We are going to take this information, this evidence. I'm going to take it to everybody who can use it.
So what do you really think needs to happen right now? You've done the report. What actions do you want to see?
So, Patrick spoke about those 4 key priority areas around the empowering the system, making it a personalised process, as Fiona just spoke about, creating empowered civilians as they transition, and correcting this perception. So those are our 4 priority actions for everybody. In the report, we've also mapped our report to the UK government strategy for our veterans 2018, and we've offered goals that we think that by the end of the decade, we should all be able to aspire to. We produced a report that Robin spoke about, the bedtime reading. That is absolutely gripping stuff. It's very personal. It's exactly what Fiona and Mike were talking about. And we produced a set of toolkits for everybody, from Izzi on council to Mel and Chris on Armed Forces Charity. But, Susannah, this will all count for nothing. It will count for naught if people don't get hold of the report, read it, and ask themselves the question, what does this mean for me? I need to be lifting my sights so that I can ensure full civilian lives in the armed forces community.
Okay, absolutely. Thank you so much, Ray, and thank you for all the work that you have done at the Trust. And as you say, it's absolutely vital that people do read this report and communicate the challenges that veterans are currently facing and will face in the future. So I'd really like to thank everybody who has joined us today, either as a guest or a viewer. And if you would like to try and tackle some of the issues that you've heard about, you can really help us by spreading the word and sharing the link to liftingoursights.org.uk. It has been a real pleasure to be with you this morning, and we all hope to see you soon. Goodbye.